Okay. So I guess that's here that there's an echo. Yeah, they say that there's an echo, but I think the echo is normal because of the room, right? Yeah, all over. Yeah, no, it's not a technical thing. So being the moderator, I guess it falls on me to start the whole thing. Okay, I suppose so. Good. So thank you all for coming, and thank you all of you for also being online. You were just really synchronized on the moment I was saying the first lines. It's going to be quite casual today. It is less of a book launch in the traditional sense and more of a conversation on what how were you calling it before? The phase space that the book has created. And by phase space, I mean to avoid using the link over here, I'm going to get very bothered with pretty soon. And by phase space, we mean the opportunities, the potentials that the book has been both produced of and created the last. The echo is from me. Yeah, I know that the echo is from me. Okay. But the book has, let's say, allowed for the last more or less how many years? 10 years. 10 years. They say that the sound is muddled, but I don't know what to do about that. I can bring it a bit. Do you think I should use a microphone? But then I have to install the microphone.
First look at the volume, it's fully up.
Yeah, let me see if I can turn it down.
I think you need to turn down.
The volume where? There is no volume. There is only volume in here in the camera. So there's a microphone and a speaker there. So there's no volume here. So that's why it's not.
Do you think that if you stand closer here, it will work better?
Yeah, I could bring it a bit nearby, but the more nearby I bring it, the less they can see you because it gets distorted. So anyway, it's okay. It's okay. I will speak louder. But then you also have to speak louder. Everyone needs to speak louder. So what I was saying, sorry. Is anyone else using a microphone? Who is saving these things and who could make it work? Yeah, but it would take quite a lot of, I assume, quite a lot of time. Yeah, because this would be working.
Let's try to project and.
Anyway, let's see how it works like that. Okay, let's see how it works without it.
Should I ask him if I can find somebody? Yeah, maybe at the surface.
In this should work if we speak relatively loud. It shouldn't have a problem.
Microphone from the settings, which
To raise it more. That's so low then. Okay.
It automatically adjusts.
Okay. Is it better now? I can put it high, so yeah.
Your face is good.
Okay, I put it to the max. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Is it better now that I raised the?
That's better.
It's feedback.
Feedback because there's no second.
Yeah.
Yes, better, closer to.
Very close. Yeah, but okay, but yeah. It seems better, yes. Okay. Yeah, because the mic works, the speaker works. I don't know. Yeah, no, I think we can go with that, I suppose. And I will try to speak a bit louder.
Yes.
Yeah.
Someone will call.
No.
For the microphone, when they speak, that might not work.
Yeah.
Can you hear us from here? Is that work?
Jorge, remember we're discussing how nice their hybrid events, right? They're the best thing. Yeah. It's very cozy.
Alphonse says it seems better.
It seems better. But yeah, this it's just that I tried to turn it on and it's simply not working. I mean, it's not. I don't know.
That's where it's back up.
Probably it has no batteries. Yeah.
That's great.
But now it's okay. It's okay. I thought you were the team that. So now I suppose you hear better.
Now it's definitely another half an hour boundary experience.
Okay. I will give this to you since I'm going to be close to the mic so you can pass it around. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Good. So now I was lost. Where were I? Yeah, I was in the 12 years in the making. Okay. Not a very promising start for the event, the whole mess with the mics, but okay, let's continue from there. So yeah, what I was commenting is that the way we're going to approach the book launch today, hopefully we have no more technical issues, is that speak a bit more slowly. Now if I was I'm gonna stop checking the online stats. Okay, fine. Yeah, we're gonna approach it not the traditional way as a book launch in the common sense. We're fine. Yeah. In the common sense, we're approach it as a point to discuss things that have been produced tangentially in the course of a book development. Because the book itself is not a monograph, it's a collection of articles that have been published in various other places. And in that area, it's also representing a diverse set of interests, which Andrej, I don't think he would be offended if I were to say that they're not his own. So either the approaches that he kind of unfolded in order to speak on these interests are not his own. They're our, let's say, and our in the sense not mine and his or Heidi's mine and his, but our in the sense that they've been produced in many different, let's say, forms and formats. One of the most interesting forms and formats has always been the same name, the graduate school seminar we're doing for the last 10 years, no, 9 years, next year is going to be 10. So many of these, let's say, ideas you're gonna see if you read Andrej's book are actually ideas that have been continuously under development and discussion for quite a long time. I said I'm not going to check the chat, but okay, math, what can I do? So the plan for today is that we are going to go through some of, not all of them obviously, but through some of the 20 theses of Ecologies of architecture that we have. You can find them online on our website. I can share the link later in the chat. And you're welcome. In these 20 theses, which I think we were discussing with Andrej, we probably would need to update some of them. In these 20 theses, you will see many of the interests that are also addressed in the book in the much more condensed version, the much more direct version in these 20 theses. And these 20 theses are covering an extremely broad amount of topics, and each one of them, despite being super condensed, I would have needed an assistant to do this, so it's really difficult to multitask. Despite being super condensed as theses, they are potentially there for a quite long discussion on each one of them. My goal is not to cover all 9 of them, because out of 20 I chose 9. My goal is to go as much as we are willing to go for the next more or less 1 hour and a half. We discussed with Andrej. Andrej is the person of honor today, so I would like always to fulfill his wishes. His wish is not to take the main lead here. So the questions, if any, or the commentary is going to be coming from the other 3 esteemed gentlemen and gentle ladies in here, and from the audience. And Andrej will be either receiving the questions or commenting if he wishes so. So if you want to be silent for the rest of the hour and a half, that's so instead of the book launch where the author is not going to speak, that's the eventual goal we have in mind. Do I need to introduce you? I mean, I introduced Andrej partially. But I'm going to do what I always hate when I'm part of the audience. I'm going to give you the mic to each one of you to say a word for who you are.
Well, for those of you here that don't know me, but also at home, I'm Heidi Sohn. I'm an associate professor of architecture, philosophy, and theory. So in other words, Andrej Stavros is a colleague. And I'm here quite surprised. Congratulations.
My name is Bob. I'm a lecturer at Methods, basically, and an informal member of theory for like since I've been here. And I would also want first of all to congratulate you on publication of the book.
The book, which you have a hard copy, by the way. Yeah, so
He does, I don't.
I can do the.
Thoughts from the PDF. I want people to have on my home. I am Angeliki Sioli. I have no idea why Andrej invited me here, and that's going to be one of the first questions to him. I'm preparing the role. I'm involved in the methods of analysis and imagination, and always very happy for theoretical discussions. Congratulations on it. It's beautiful. Thank you very much.
Want to introduce yourself?
I just want to thank you for coming here. And one of the reasons is, of course, we love you. The other reason is not to make this too
endogamous.
Yeah. Because we have done with these people here.
So we want to break our family. Okay.
Or join it, you know,
Or, yeah,
there's
or
always a
start with
chair
the family.
for the family.
But anyway, there is another reason, because it was not Andrej's idea. It was, if I have to be open, it was partially my idea to have someone to come from, because you could be as open as you would like to be today, first of all, okay? So some of the things here, I think there is radically different perspectives on some of these elements. I think we were discussing.
That's true.
So the point will be also discussing from the different perspectives rather than just agree with one another. Okay, so shall we go straight into it, right? Yes, okay. I'm going to be reading each one of those, and then I'm not going to be, sorry?
Slowly.
Slowly, with the mic in a proper distance so it doesn't muffle. And then I'm going to let you comment. I will, as I promised, not start from Andre. I have in my mind someone to start from for each one of those.
All right.
You are looking, it's not going to be you for this one.
Okay.
So you are down. I think Robert already knows it's not him. Because we always speak things with Robert. That's his cares. So the first thesis of the EOA or the AE, because we distorted it for some reason, I don't know why, of the Ecologies of Architecture is that it aims to promote a non-reductionist approach to architecture by insisting on the entanglement and irreducibility of the three ecologies, which three ecologies are the environmental, the psychic or the psyche, and the collective or the social, if we were to simplify it. Andre, when writing this thesis, the first one, he wanted to insist on the last sentence that none of these resistors should take a backseat ever again. So always they should be brought together. Robert, how would you comment on the entanglement or absence thereof in our approaches in the epistemic practices of the three ecologies? In architectural studies, not just general.
I mean, the point is that I think in architecture we have a very particular understanding of ecology, first of all, no? And that comes, of course, with sustainability discourse, in a sense, the entire fact that architecture is always seen as something cultural, that is, in a sense, opposed to nature. There's a technological component to it. So the question about ecology is usually something that feels we need to go back to something, something that is more natural, actually, and contest this kind of technologization.
Don't look at me on there.
No, I mean, I need something to look at, and I'm all looking a little bit at that.
Yeah.
And I think the point that we talk about, not ecology, but a plurality of ecologies that is addressed by this, of course, to understand that there's not such thing as ecology that is directly equated with green things and so on. And the very idea of the three ecologies, for those that don't know, it comes, of course, from Felix Guattari, who had promoted this idea that there are three ecologies that basically are three different dynamics that are always environmental dynamics, social dynamics, and in this idea, mental dynamics, or psyche. That cannot be understood in isolation. They can be analytically decomposed so that they can be looked at, let's say, from one angle. But when they're then separated across disciplines, like, for example, architecture, the social sciences, and maybe engineering or psychology or so, then there happens something that, in a sense, they become disentangled, and we fail to understand these things are related. The way this room is shapes our social interactions. The fact that it's technologically mediated reshapes our social interactions. The way that technology malfunctions makes certain malfunctions with our psyche, and so on, and so on, and so on. Those kind of things, I think, exactly. No? So I think that's actually where there are certain specialist discourses, but they are not to be contained. And therefore, I think an ecological approach is really to understand these kind of relationships between them and understand them also as co-constitutive.
So how would you connect that to transdisciplinarity, for example? Because that's what I'm listening to.
Exactly, because that's what I was just about to say. So in the moment that you understand that co-constitutive aspect, then you would understand them as transversal, first of all. And that means that it cuts across all those domains and they need to be connected. And in order to do that as an architect, of course, have to promote a transdisciplinary stance, not just a multidisciplinary one, where you want to actually bridge these kind of gaps that have occurred in our systems of knowledge because they have been so separated.
But again, I'm gonna...
And not only stitch them together or bridge them, but also make them evident.
No, but you can put.
He wants to say.
No, you're not allowed.
Yes, of course.
Yes, it's allowed.
I just want to add one thing. Architecture is famously undecided whether it belongs to sciences or humanities, and depending on, we know this, especially speaking from the core of the technical university. So we could say that almost by default, people this public building would believe that the materiality has to be favored over the let's say the discursive part of the equation. And this, of course, what we're trying to do here, all of us, is to avoid the trap of reductionism. So because we know that sciences always prefer the micro level, they consider it to be more real than the so-called illusions of the macro level.
The social prefers that.
Exactly. And then the other way around, the humanities, they consider the society, culture, and so on to be more real than the actual particles, strings, and atoms. So we're trying to avoid the trap of micro and macro reductionism and what we immediately say and meso reductionism. So keeping them all the balls in the air.
Okay. You're saving because you're doing, you're bypassing me. That's great. Yeah, I have no problem at all. Continue. But I have a provocation in the end towards all of you. But yeah.
Thank you so much.
I thank you. Yeah.
And two things are coming to mind. First of all, this wonderful book for definitions of architecture by Steve Purcell, published a few years ago, which traces the historical contexts that have defined whether architecture in particular time periods are part of the engineering world, part of the Beaux-Arts, as it used to be in Europe. And it's a fantastic reference when it comes to this conversation, offering wonderful insights of how we can deal with this very significant issue. And it's very beautiful to see the very vivid changes when a school department faculty of architecture belongs to a different context. I used to be in a school of architecture that was part of the College of Art and Design, which was, it's not the norm. Usually the norm is part of engineering, and it was a very different approach towards architecture. And it's beautiful to see these differences and study them, and how these different contexts allow for all these things to come to the surface to make them palpable, as you say. I have a question for you guys. You know that I am an adamant phenomenologist, and I think I have been invited here because of that.
You realize.
And of course, this has a very, very clear phenomenological foundation, very clear.
I will let the esteemed.
And I can explain, I mean, I don't need to explain to you, but it has a very clear phenomenological foundation where our thoughts are not our thoughts if it's not always in connection with our body, with the environment, with social conditions, and thinking different thoughts living in Delft in the Netherlands than living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Yeah.
And I can keep going.
No, I'm not going to respond to that. Yeah.
Why do you guys avoid the word phenomenology?
Who is going to be in the order of the who will be
The last part of the question is more funny, but
yeah.
like there's a foundation there, and I was wondering how much this is part of what you're interested in.
I mean, I think the point is not to necessarily avoid phenomenology, but there is a specific word that's called phenomenological reduction. And that is similar, I think, to, let's say, the meso-reductionist point of view, where, let's say, meso-reduction is basically that you reduce everything to a level of praxis. That praxis is more real than anything else. In a kind of similar way, I think there's a problem with understanding processes and how processes come to matter, to maybe use Barat's term. And Barat, for example, critiques this idea of phenomenological reduction. I think I can't remember who said that. But there is a conflation with, let's say, for example, that car factory doesn't resemble the car that is produced. So the production process doesn't resemble the facility with which it is produced. And I think in architecture a lot, but also in, let's say, phenomenological discourse, there's this danger of conflating, in a sense, the product with a production process. And
I understand phenomenology.
yeah, no, exactly.
But
So
I understand phenomenology, because there's a lot of misconceptions.
Exactly. And it has something to do with that, let's say, to understand the phenomena as generated. So the genetic angle is always the antidote, basically, to this timid structuralism that could come in the way there, where it is more about process ontology, becomings, and the material becomings with which they take form that are to be studied in ecological terms as dynamic systems without necessarily reducing them to the final forms they get, because that's exactly what it's subjective. It matters on the context. And so.
But now I'm going to break my own rules. But no, I will solve. My problem is more simple. I mean, it's complementary to both, but it's even more basic and simple. I have no problem with phenomenology as long as it's not only about human beings.
Yeah.
But that's not what most phenomenologists do.
No, but there's like a lot of schools within.
Yeah, no, I know. But within architecture,
I am mainly from Terminological humanities, which is works with a much wider context and world. No.
But anyway, I'm not going to intervene much more. So yeah.
But I think it's crucial. I think this is really crucial because I will not ever get anywhere close to your clarity of exposition explanation. So how I see it is more through the discourse side of it. So, well, it's not avoiding phenomenology, it's trying not to model, So new materialist positions with phenomenological positions, which, they have a tradition and a school and thinkers and, their boundaries. And the angles from what I think we approach it through a new materialist angle, which is, if you like, of course, there will be like proponents of neo-phenomenology, where phenomenology would be looking at post-humanism or more than human, or but it's perhaps as a way to keep the boundaries within the forms of knowledge, not I wouldn't say intact, but respectfully there. That's what I think to answer.
No?
No, he has something to add.
Yeah. No, he has a lot of things to say about phenomenology, but
No, help you. Are you already upset for inviting?
No.
That's the reason.
Really like it. I think for the sake of everybody here, it's also, we should be very open about the tradition that we claim for ourselves. And I would say your phenomenology, your position is a part of the linguistic theory. And we proudly say that we are trying to kind of introduce an affective theory. So that might be one of these things. And I think you did underline hermeneutics. And I think we would be more interested in the heuristics, in the trial and error. Because in phenomenology, it's super general, broad. It's about the conditions of possibility for something to appear. So you're always interested in the foundation, how something can become legitimate. Any claim. So hermeneutically kind of trying to understand what are the conditions of possibility of something to appear. I think in effective term, yesterday in another occasion, I was claiming that it's stepping out of a long tradition of representation because the real conditions of possibility have nothing whatsoever to do in terms of that there is a relation, but not of resemblance. There is no isomorphism between real conditions and that which appears in the affective term, as opposed to that makes sense.
No, I'm just like.
Maybe contradict that later.
So, but you can respond. You can respond now.
You never go.
No, you can say what you want to say. There's no academic.
One of the questions is language, and then about the effective and effective. How do you respond to that?
Okay.
Now I have to put a 5-minute counter on it. Yes.
I see again. Gattari is my go-to person in this sense, and he says something that I really believe is language is one small part of the huge sea of semiotic potential. It's important. It's actually fantastic because it's invented in the sense it gives us a chance to do something that we could have not done without it. But it's one that let's not forget that it's a small island in the huge ocean of asignifying or non-signifying regimes of signification. So to me, to privilege one over those others is a reductionist.
That's the reason to continue coming back. Do you want to comment on anything further or not? No, I will leave it there. And then, I'm just going to be reading anyway the thesis, so it's not that I'm going to see what's right there. So continuing in the same line, the ecologies of architecture adopt a minor tradition that challenges the logic of discreteness, which is creating binaries, and rejecting facile binaries, such as nature, culture, matter, memory, space and time, object and subject, exterior, interior, in favor of a thinking that is focused on continuity. Okay? So it tries to overcome the modernist techno-reductionism, reducing everything to. Now I'm trying to simplify it on the go, and it's difficult to simplify it on the go. So Techno Determinism, which is an abstraction that dominates everything, so everything needs to be abstracted, neither by falling on the other opposite, which is relativizing everything, which is a postmodern attitude, which basically says that everything goes. So between the modern Skila, as they used to call it, and the postmodern Charybdis, which is either everything goes, the postmodern attitude, or nothing goes as long as we agree upon it, which is a modern attitude, there should be an in-between. There is an in-between. And that's what the continuity refers to. Mrs. Heidi, Sohn.
Well, that's
How would you like to comment on the binary?
First of all, I don't think it is the continuity, it's actually a continuum, right?
Yeah.
So, well, it's not that it's not the continuity, but it's more focused on continuum, right? So first that, and then the second is how a binary would actually put a stop on it.
Yeah.
You know, how it, that is the blockage continuum of process, and of course, if you have a blockage, there is no becoming.
Yeah.
Then there is being, and then there is a moment, there is an identity, and then there's a stop in the chain of differentiation.
In the logics of continuity, though, and on the opposite of those, which has to do with the binaries that they produce, which of those binary you would consider to be the most either interesting to examine or the most devastating in the consequences it has?
Well, the most devastating of all has, of course, been nature culture. You know, that's, in my opinion, that has been the binary.
And why, from an architectural perspective?
Maybe, well, first of all, not from an architectural position, but from a, from a general position. Placing a difference between nature and culture makes it appear as if both exist. So as if nature is a thing, as if culture is a thing, when in reality they are continuous. So putting a stop between them and making a binary is an artificial move that creates a lot of, I would say, blockages of flow and continuum.
Yeah.
So also change that happens over a continuum, and binaries actually stop. So binaries thinking stops that. Now in architecture, but in architectural thinking, I guess more than in architecture as a thing, in the thinking of architecture, thinking as nature, culture, as separate domains or registers or logics,
Yeah.
with guess, reduces also what we can do as a scope. So how do we work with that scope of oh, we only exist in nature, or we only exist in culture, and architecture tends to take over the culture aspect. So we are expressions of culture, we're representations of culture, reflections of culture, but in reality, architecture is much, much more. And I think that is a different thesis. That's a different point.
You checked them before?
Of course, I mean, I think this is like the Bible. We read them every night before we go to bed.
Yeah.
No, but it's obviously the point that I'm trying to do here is or to make is that there shouldn't be that obstacle.
Yeah.
And we should be very much aware that binarisms or binary thoughts create stoppages in the chain of difference. Heterogeneity.
I will intend because I know I will control myself. Robert, what is your favorite binary there?
My favorite binary is no binary.
You know what I mean in the negative sense of the term. So what's a binary you find more problematic of all there? Or more foundational?
I wanted to actually say which I find the most interesting.
Okay, so you see,
which I think is the, let's say, the conceptual distinction between extensive and intensive. Okay. Because it is, let's say, it's a conceptual distinction that cannot be fully disentangled in some sense, but it gives us a certain pointer of maybe making some crucial distinction.
But since it's not written there, could you give your two or more pennies on the extensive and intensive?
Yeah, let's say, so in a sense, extensive properties are everything that is metrically measured. So you need a metric in order to locate certain things. No, it's about extensions, about spaces, dimensions, which have units and so on. And intensive things, I think it's mentioned in the book also, and they always mention that if you have 90 degrees of water, you can't divide it into two portions of 45 degrees of water. So it's an intensive property within a certain volume. And that requires you to not think in terms of classifications, about units and so on, but it makes you think about phase spaces, potentialities, energy, all these things that are just immanent to certain formations. And if you are on that side of that spectrum, then you are, for example, also more in the inclination of using extensive properties, let's say, more carefully.
I was going to break the binaries, and since Jorge, I think he might want to comment. No, you're sure.
And in fact, there's an extra chair.
Don't be respectful for the sake of it.
I'm just looking at the question.
Okay.
Being asked in parallel.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Rejects facile bifurcation such as nature culture, matter memory,
Yeah.
object subject exterior interior.
Yeah.
Somehow I understand. Matter memory, I could think of other possible ways of expressing that. But
Yeah.
space time,
Yes.
explain that. How can we think the one without the other? Who's
I mean,
thinking the
I
one
put
without
that-
the other? Who's thinking those two as different things or so
Yes.
so separate that you have put it that there in number
The
three?
space and time. Okay, I'm not going to respond. Yeah, if you want to respond, or I can give you some minutes to think of it. But I would say that I mean, in all our practices, and I mean, I'm trying to be very naive with the way I approach stuff. In the practices, for example, in architectural school, we continue to. I mean, if we were in good time, we include it in a very limited form, but we are not. I mean, I don't know. Perhaps you might be introducing new ways of doing it, and then we could do some stuff together. We should do more stuff together often. But in most of the traditional, let's say, or the more established ways of teaching architecture, time is totally disregarded.
Or as an
Space is simultaneity, and
Yeah.
time is moving. It's from
Yeah.
that sense.
I mean, do you see
I
anything?
wouldn't
Do you see
take, I wouldn't
anything?
take that as a value, like as
No,
space
no.
value.
It's
And
of
then
course-
also space can, we can also argue that it's kind of disregarded because there's a lot of interesting in place.
Yeah, but it's
So the space time to me is very problematic in this statement.
But it's when you speak about space, I mean, think of the very simple forms of representing space, which are fully dominating in architectural pedagogy. So the thing that most students, okay, I thought someone was confirming, but okay, the thing that most students encounter, I mean, we're being taught architecture is something that has to do with how you annotate and represent properly, and what do you annotate and represent properly? Space, as it's measured down in meters, centimeters, millimeters, hectares, or whatever. How would you? First of all, how could you break down time? You cannot really break down time. How could you introduce it in our pedagogies? I mean, you say it's here. I would really.
It's
I would-
definitely here. We're just next door. Come visit.
No, but here, okay, here, not to mean
And
here
here,
in our attitude towards understanding architecture in general. And then, okay, then to provoke you. Then when we include time to provoke you, I hope I gave you enough time to also think of a response. We introduce it in the form of narratives or narrations, which I find. Not only, but
through
mostly.
materiality, through so many other ways, through social considerations, through so many ways.
But I
Okay,
think
back me up here.
our perception,
Jorge is like all about that.
I agree. But our perception of time, again, our human-based perception of time, even in its own right, is not and should not be the one that actually has to be told, if not to be diversified, first of all, because our perception of time is a very specific one. And it does not have to do with time. The way we perceive time is not about time. It's a different discussion, perception of time and time itself.
But the point that this makes is about the
It's about the facile disjunction. No?
Yes,
It's
yes.
about the either or. So that it doesn't mean that in a sense architects generally architects neglect time, but there is this kind of the concepts that we operate. There is a conceptual distinction between spatial and temporal aspects, where if they would not be disentangled in the first place, and we think more in terms of becomings, past dependencies, whatever these concepts would be that do not require an either or, but a both and, both spatial and temporal, then that would foster a different stance.
But it's
That
not
in a
only.
sense challenges the facile disjunction based on which this.
I should avoid gearing up, but it's not only, you could include time, but you could include it in a way that disregards time. What do I mean? If you go to the lab, and I don't know, I mean, we didn't want to make you the point of, but if you go to a lab, the laboratory, which is always a closed system, so that's what laboratories do. They have time in there, physics have time in there, normal traditional physics, but they have it as something that's reversible. So for traditional physics, which translates to many other disciplines of ours, time has an arrow that goes to one direction, and easily we can move the arrow back and go back to the initial state of the closed experimental condition. And that's something that we also have appropriated, I would say, both in architecture, but also in most social sciences.
with you, but I really think that
But we insist on
we
that anymore.
I insist, but I really believe that we're in an environment that this binary is really challenged. I cannot understand why this is, I mean, in our faculty, I think this is a binary really challenged, particularly by some of the.
So
Anyways, but
I don't really think what is the problem then. So if in this statement or in this, I would call it a thesis, in this statement, we're actually inviting everybody who's still not in that wagon to reject binarisms, whether they're facile or they're literally exclusive disjunctions. No. So if we are already doing it the right way here, well, congratulations. But the fact is that there is still that hyphen between, or actually the slash between space and time. There still is. And the way that we think, very much agree. So I think this is
So the tradition being established in this conversation is that Andrej has the last word. So that's what we offer you as a gift for
you're
that.
imagining open space outside time.
No, but that's. I go away.
One of the articles, one of the chapters, the title is Space Comes Last. Because this doesn't really exist. Exactly. I want to perhaps go back time, like how real is time? And I draw here a beautiful example from the Architectures of Time, Stanford Winter, where he says, let's imagine what role does the time play in the morphogenesis of an ice cube. So you have the mold, it's filled with water, and every single cube is virtually the same. And he says, let us now consider something else, the morphogenesis of a snowflake that picks up all the nuances in the trajectory as it gains shape regarding the pressure, temperature, the speck of dust that acts as a catalyst to this. So in that sense of the morphogenesis of the snowflake, time plays a real role. It's real. The other one is so, and it's interesting to see because then we can actually associate the first case with the molding, allomorphic practice of having a mold forcing, domesticating, taming matter forcefully, and the other one is modulating. And of course, we know that no two snowflakes are the same. So it produces kind of, it taps into morphogenetic capacity of matter itself to produce.
But I think there is a response to some of these questions in the next chosen one, which has to do that the opposition basically is against the primacy of what's called physical world. I would call space again. Okay, I mean, but the alternative or one of the alternatives could be what is being termed as the Umwelt. Okay, so the emphasis is on the encounter, where experience is seen as an emergence which returns up to the body to a process field of exteriority. Andrej will need to explain what he means by process field of exteriority. And say he because we rolled them together, but there is negotiations in there. It doesn't mean that we always agree 100%. So sensibility introduces an aleatory moment into thought's development, thereby effectively turning contingency into the very condition for thinking. So you have, it's been placed, let's say, the Umwelt as something that could perhaps negotiate better the space-time distinction or not. Yes. I can keep on having the word on you now, so yeah, you can respond to that.
Yes, indeed. So,
but what would you mean by the Umwelt?
Umwelt is that portion of the world that is defined, determined by the response hyphen ability, the capacity to respond. So not everything is included. Each organism is attuned to those features of the environment that matter for its and not to drive it into the corner of human exceptionalism, we happen to be those creatures who don't simply adopt what is already there, but we also, at one point, literally 4 billion years ago, we decided to outsource or exteriorize some of the capacities to take our organs out, exosomatize to produce something that was not meant to be. So we have created an alternative evolutionary trajectory, which is evolution that means other than life, as Stiglitz calls it. Shameless plug in Bob and I are just about to publish an issue on the epiphylogenesis, which deals with this thoroughly, this process of evolution by means other than life. And architecture is, from that point of view, could be considered as really crucial in this exo-organization. It's something that now, once it's not doesn't belong to the interior, actually provides for the new possibilities, new capacity. So it's modulating input differently. And of course, this is connected to the idea of that thought is not voluntary. In order to think, one has to be provoked, and it's provoked by way of a genuine encounter with something that cannot be subsumed by already given.
And architecture, how would you position it in there in terms of its capacity to do what with experience or with encounter?
The capacity.
Or I mean, if you can also pass the thing if you don't wanna, but yeah, if you can take upon it, go for it.
In architecture, in this way that I'm trying to argue. Some expectations. So it does not count on a fully given audience that needs to be fed with what they expect. I think it was true here. It was my favorite line. I hope I can recreate it. Architecture is at its best that it does not fulfill the obligations that society requires of. In other words, producing circumstances that shake us out of the habitual, let's say.
So that's what you would mean when it's about the process of an exteriority.
Yes, yes, exactly. And you would be more qualified to talk about this in terms of like future exteriority as futurity versus interiority as the past, calculated past.
I also
so that you would probably, if I was to speculate, you would probably immediately say that it is then about the negotiation, the boundary between that which is exterior to come and something that is already sedimented and calculated.
But we do it every second day, so that's But I saw Angeliki that she was on the Umwelt knowledge, so I think you either have a take on the Umwelt or you.
You said 4,000 years ago.
For a million years.
4 million years
At the
ago.
moment, a proto-human picked it. Yes, only used it to do something.
Used the tool, right?
Yeah, yes, exactly.
But don't you consider an architectural moment there?
For me, that's architectural really. Yes. Because
Phenomenological, because the tool becomes part of the body.
I think then you privilege the body. I would say it's a new assemblage. That it's the body plus the tool that creates something that is neither reducible to the body or the tool.
So it's the two together.
So it's not a prosthesis, it's a new assemblage.
Very nice. Okay, very good. I see that.
Because when you say prosthesis, you immediately mean I'm enhancing something that's already there.
Okay.
I don't.
And you don't like also the hierarchy between the one and the other. I understand. I understand. You were saying that Chumi said that the architecture is the thing that shouldn't be
So
fulfilling.
it's best when it doesn't fulfill the promise.
Of what?
Of fully constituting society. The
So that you don't
I have a Chuma question that starts at the
In analogy with art, the really kind of piece of art that can produce its own audience without counting on an already ready-made audience that just simply gets more of the Fast and Furious 1, Fast and Furious 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you know exactly. But that architecture or piece of art that can create something, rewire the brain, so to create its own audience that is not yet there. This is the point. People is not there. They have to be fashioned. So
And sense has to be made. That you were saying it before, right? The meaning has to be made, as you were saying.
it's never given. It's always made.
Okay, that's very nice. There's also a danger there, though. From like what Chumi says is like its architecture is at its best when it's not fulfilling the promise to the society. Or there's also a little bit of a danger there because how do you prevent from an architect who is in a dictate, like as a small dictator, is like imposing things that may be completely against, inappropriate. I know that's a tricky term. We talked about that. And with Chumi in particular, since you're taking the example there, Stavros knows the example in Athens, right? He completely disregarded some cultural monuments in the New Acropolis Museum, and it's like a huge scandal. And still, it's a conversation. Like, really, is this really architecture at its best when it's disregarding or it's not fulfilling the possibilities or the expectations? And why is the expectation necessarily something negative?
Well, he has even more extreme. The one that architecture needs to be able to commit murder in order to
Yeah.
Yeah, but the example in Athens is really, I mean, he was already, it is a huge thing because it was a building of immense, super low historically, of course, it's the new Acropolis Museum. There were 3 international competitions. Only the 3rd one reached an end result. And it was obvious that there was, he completely disregarded everything from the program and he was just offered the building as a star architect. And the star architect is pretty much doing what you're saying, is completely disregarding. So where is our ethical stance on that? And why should we bring it to me like that and think that this is an important value person?
You first do the response, and then Heidi's going to have a word on anything if I want.
Do whatever you want with it, Mike.
Yeah, do whatever you want with it.
I wanted to maybe introduce then chapter 11 on evolutionary architecture, because I think in that chapter you discussed most explicitly the notion of Umwelt. And you start actually, maybe that clarifies the problem we have with Jumi, is that men are conscious of their own desire, but are ignorant of the process whereby that desire has been determined. And I think that has something to do with that kind of reciprocity that you mentioned before between tools and humans, and how none can be privileged. No, because that would require that, you know, it's not Jumi necessarily to blame, because there's an entire system of control, backup, competitions, and so on that has co-enacted that situation from occurring, you know, an entire cultural reinvention and so on. So what I think what the point is that in analytical terms, it's not reducible to any of the components, but it has to be, in a sense, understood within the assemblage in which those take parts, and the forces through which certain things that come to matter in specific ways. And that is only, let's say, a slight analytical shift that, in a sense, we're saying there's a lot of, let's say, emphasis in explaining things by always, finding somebody or some context as a certain cause. And let's say, I think what the involutionary process would argue is that it folds in, or it selects for a certain solution of a certain problem, and it is determined constitutively, but it cannot be reduced to somebody's agency or some kind of constraint. So, and I think that shifts the analytical emphasis on, let's say, the concatenations of certain events or something. So that's where this kind of assemblage theoretic notion that, in a sense, underlies this idea of ecologies wouldn't try to define the guild somewhere there, and it would rather understand that as a phenomenon that has occurred, and it would use that systems logic to just problematize it as we do it. But it's just a slight analytical shift of emphasis.
You know, you're next, Heidi.
No.
No, you don't want to comment?
There's nothing I can add.
There's nothing you can add?
Brilliant.
Well, I can add an example, but Nietzsche was proven. No, it's fine. It's okay. It's okay.
Can I quote Nietzsche? Go for it.
No, I'm going to quote Nietzsche. I mean, it's again, I don't want to make it in the central focal point there, but on the point that says he made on to me, and now I'm speaking too fast. Nietzsche was commenting that you don't separate when you hear a thunderstorm in a thunderstorm. Okay, you see a lightning, you hear thunder. No one in the same mind would separate the lightning from the thunder. You know, they're one and the same thing. It's caused. The one causes the other, let's say. So I wouldn't put a finger on being to be the one or the other person or that other person doing that thing. Just complement. So it's about the Umwelt in that sense. That's also what's mentioned in this thesis. It's about the Umwelt as something that necessitates both the subject that acts on it and also gives the capacities of the subject to change itself and the Umwelt. We do what our environment allows us to do, and doing more of those things or less, we also change the environment, introducing things we never thought of. And that's why I think architecture is very important in there, because it's literally precisely on that, on environmental change that can literally change a human being.
It's a very different way of putting it, of doing things. We do what the environment allows us to do, and of course we change by doing things that we were not expected to do. That's a very different way of putting that, and putting it that architecture is at its best when it does not fulfill the possibilities. Expectation. These are you probably brought it up meaning that, but these are very different ways.
I find the more condensed version of saying that, but
I'm trying to give you a compliment that you're saying it better. You understand that?
Assuming that I would like or have any high speed for me, but
No, not at all. It's actually, I think that is important again to kind of put it in brackets. When did he say that? Under which context? So it's of course taking that out of the context where that idea comes from. So yeah. I don't want that.
So you can stay with the mic. Andrew was okay.
Just one.
Just one idea.
A short comment.
Very short. The idea of why is it necessary not to cater for the needs, but try to think to provoke something. It has to do with the idea of the image of thought. All the things that we unwittingly kind of appropriate, so much so that we are not even conscious of the fact that before we even start creating anything, we are already fully under the spell of something that is preventing us from thinking otherwise. And it happens to the best of us. and I think Delft very famously called this the image of thought. So they say, they use the famous figure of the painter Francis Bacon, who says it's in the book of Bacon that illustrates it's not about the what we often refer to as the paralysis of the blank sheet of paper or blank canvas. So yeah, what do I do? They say it's the exact opposite of that. Everything before you start is already fully saturated with the cliche upon cliche upon cliche. So in that sense, I think this is offering a way of ridding ourselves of all the cliches that we are victims of, subject to. And I think that's how I see it. And of course, with Chumi, it goes all the way. Yes, okay.
I will give it back to Heidi in a second, but because it goes to what is called non-personal or impersonal micropolitics. So this is the most loaded with Lingo. So yeah, it's right in the middle. We're not going to finish them all, but it's okay, no problem. So the lesson, the ethico-political lesson, and I know Jorge might already find it problematic that it's been called the lesson, but anyway, the lesson, the ethico-political one, of a logic of intensity is that all things are contingent, let's call it like that, necessarily contingent, and not logically bound to happen. I'm translating on the go. So things happen always contingently, and nothing is written in advance. That's what it's said here. In there lies the possibility of finding a transdisciplinary project of defatalization, so going against teleology, going against predetermined things. Okay. And why is it connected with politics? Because one must avoid reducing the world to one's own conceptual schemes, which I would call ideologies, because they're not abstract enough. So finally, interestingly, an ideology is not abstract enough to speak about the world. Conversely, one has to be primed for something that is called non-recognition. And its concept needs to be related to the very variables, to the things that actually determine how it's changing. So if you want to speak about ideology, you have to understand how it's produced, more or less. That's what is the point there. From, again, from an architectural perspective, in relation with politics, how would you comment on that, Heidi?
No.
On architecture and ideology as a relation? No, okay, no. I agree, no. But,
I won't comment on that at all, because this is my opportunity to ask my colleague Andrej what he means by this. Because this is the thesis that has always bothered me. I want to understand what it means. So this is my moment to ask you, Andrej, what exactly do you mean?
You skipped it in a very eloquent
No,
way.
it's true. She's expressing the at least 10 years that I wanted to ask. Especially the first part, you know, the first part.
So this is first of all that the contingency and necessity don't necessarily need to be opposed in a strictly binary way. So something is either necessary or simply contingent. Because in the process ontology, it is impossible to tell in advance. One has to intervene into the causal fabric in order to tease out those moments of singularities by bifurcations. And of course, this means that they are not over there and we are over here. It requires a certain, referred to earlier as the hermeneutics trial and error. There's no other way. So that means that it's an open system which requires effort something to be teased out. So that's one thing.
You see, that's what some extra time. That's what you wanted to do.
No, it's not extra time. It's something that I wanted to have a conversation with you about, because I remember one of the things that every time I think about it, my heart starts to race faster. is Brian Musumi's short idea of a hand-to-hand battle with matter. So when you can't really make, in terms of, I don't know, like a typology, you can't really think in advance of that typology. It's this kind of battle that you have to go, and he gives the example of working with wood and, teasing out the shape. So that's one of the conversations I want, because it is about politics also. So what is the connection there? How is it political?
There's an essay by Gregory Bateson, I want to use, and I look at the question where he says, I want to make an analogy with the idea of, thinking in molar terms, you can identify a certain action. You could say, somebody has an axe that goes through the forest and chops down the tree. So there's this person when they chop the tree. But Bateson says, no, we have to be more careful, because in every stroke, there is a negotiation of difference. So a better way of describing it would be to say there's a difference in involves everything, the movement of your eyes, the movement of your head on your neck, the way that you regain stability. So he says, perhaps the best way would be to write it in terms of in terms like differences in this, differences, and all these differences eventually build something that we might, in a truly reductionist way, call there's a person who cut the tree. But we're missing the point, and this is why it's still to this day in artificial intelligence robotics it becomes a holy grail. How do you program that? Precisely because it's not a symbolic thing. It cannot be reduced to a man went and chopped down the tree. I think I would answer your question directly. So for me, that's this distinction between the politics with a capital P, which is a modern term, but this is always. This comment to Jorge, I told him it's messianic, because we know exactly, or we are trying to figure out what do the program first, we identify it, we agree on it, and then we are devising ways of getting there, and we know how this happens. I would contrast this with acting, and I'm drawing here on possibility, who says instead of thinking about the politics as a moral issue, we should be thinking in how could we work politically in everything that we do. And that is to do with these negotiations at the level that is represented.
I have one next follow-up here. So yeah, I get this. But so when I'm thinking about the ethical-political aspects, I can't help but imagining, right? And you give a good example, tree and so on. I understand that there is intentionality. So how do we put the intentionality next to this theological, or there's a theology of reaching, like I want to wood the tree, so I cut it. So then we reduce, but it's much more, it's a politics of affect. And we reduce it to an identity and an intentionality that is a will, and this will is directed towards, I don't know, this thing that is made of wood. So it's intentionality, maybe, how can we rethink or think again on intentionality in relation?
I'm going to take my role as moderator, and I'm going to ask Robert to respond, because I know he likes to speak about Deacon. I would respond.
Okay, yes,
but yeah, so I don't want to tell you how to respond. But I know.
They would like you have to respond that way.
I know. No. So forget Deacon. I know how. No. I want to open the conversation that you will do. So I want you to say what I know, but you're very capable of saying it down in teleology. That's why I'm putting it there.
I thought you wanted me to talk about intentionality.
But you
But
say.
isn't it the same? I mean, how it's not the same. But isn't the teleology and intentionality like almost like articulated at the hip?
Exactly. So I mean, let's say to put it super short. I mean, like the point that Andrej makes us in the book is the slight difference between the Deconian difference between teleology and teleonomy. Teleology is basically assuming the end independent of the process, some kind of abstract.
In advance.
Exactly. So as if, let's say, there is only, like, it has to be based on cliches, it has to be based on myths, or like some sort of generality, where you assume, oh, most of these processes typically end up there.
Thus?
And then it becomes, in a sense, ideological, or like image of thought, that this type of process always leads to that kind of thing. And of course, even the worse.
You said we think of the final end result without the process, and it's either based on either cliches or is imagination at all?
challenging this position?
I'll bring that in because that I think is more on a telenomic perspective. The point would be that let's say there is a path that leads to a certain thing. If I manage to open up, let's say my hand one here,
There is an image in here from Waddington's epigenetic landscape, if I can find it somewhere. But you find it.
Yeah. But it's
the point, I think the point is that let me quickly finish this distinction between teleonomy and teleology. So the point is that I say teleology would assume this kind of one end. Teleonomy
is ball going down the field of, let's say it's a mountainous, let's say a landscape, imagine like that, and a ball flowing around that. It's a valley, yeah.
Teleonomy would, in a sense, understand that the end is constructed in the process. So it's something that I think also Carola always calls path dependency. So it is, there is of course an aim, there's something that a tendency in certain processes, but it doesn't end to the same thing. And then the idea about intention is of course that it creates a tension where about something should go either in this or that direction. But this entire thing is a path-dependent process. It, in a sense, selects its own end. Foucault also made a similar observation when he argued that dispositives always lead, in some sense, to or solutions always get the answers depending on how they are posed. Yeah, exactly. So, and there's a fine distinction between the idea of imagination sets a certain goal, but it's not abstract. It's based on a process, it's reevaluated in a process. When I think as a designer, you constantly know that this kind of checking back, seeing where things go, keeping it to a certain degree open. And that's very different from, let's say, this very hardcore teleological understanding that is often used to explain processes, specifically when you trace them in the past.
So direction would be another. But still, we're kind of like, we're not getting there, I think, but how is it ethical, political, and not ethical, static, or ethical, something else? Why is it political?
It's the third time she has to do it.
The same question.
It is
I have a response, but I will let you.
Let me out here because I'm
I saw, I mean, we've done this
Yes.
times, but no, but I will have to. No, I would respond not on behalf of Andrej because it's my take on it, but the political is not. Let's see where it's coming from. Okay, political is essentially having to do with polis, which is the realm of the collective. Let's call it like that. Okay, the urban condition. It's a collective condition. So it's an ethical collective, ethico-social lesson. Okay. Approaching things like that, you're opening yourself to the possibility of being attuned with the collective transformations, including yourself, without predetermining them in a given end. What ideology is doing is actually removing the potential for collectivization, not in the sense of the Stalinist collectivization. I mean, collectivization in the sense of becoming part of collectives, you know. That's what ideology is doing. Even when you are getting together with your own similarly ideological collectives, you're just getting to be more familiar with yourself. So you're just getting to be more friendly with yourself, more assured of yourself, more happy with yourself. But that's not political. It's me, I'm great, I'm fine with the people I love. You know? But that's not political. In the sense, it's not defamiliarizing, it's not removing you from your comfort zone in order to be open to the potential of other collectives and the formation of other collectives, because that's what supposed to be politics is about.
I have a question on that.
And in that sense, ideology, again, the bottom line from there, ideology again is going against, it's going opposite the potential of a political formation.
Yes.
Even when it's called political with capital P, that's what Andrej was calling modern politics. Yes. And architecture, I'm going to stop the monologue, architecture plays a role there, because architecture, I would say, designs the very potentials for the collectives, political collectives, to come together or to be opposed, to be stopped, to be placed, let's say, on the side, and reinforce just the familiarity.
Yes, and intention. So, like, it sounds like a pun, but it's not. It's like intention. No? If there is no intention, so you know, the space in between things, that is where I guess the energy of the political, it is understood in this statement, comes from. So, one of the things that we stumble over is the preconception that we have about what certain terms mean or are supposed to mean,
or are in fact forced to mean. So I see eyebrows going on, you see ethical, political, and all this jargon that we're putting up there. So I think one of the challenges is to rethink, think again, and then question again and over again what exactly is that this like these ideas mean, they are really signifying. I suppose because it is one of the things, the cliches that you mentioned, it's one of the biggest challenges is to get out of what we intend our jargon to mean. And when I say jargon, I don't mean our jargon, or I mean politics or ideology. There are already like preconceived ideas of what ideology is supposed to mean and what it's not supposed to mean, right? Or what politics with capital T is supposed to be. So when we're confronting, the audience or your reader to a modern politics, you're confronted to a whole other way of thinking. We need to start thinking otherwise.
Exactly. And that's why not new terms have to be invented.
Yeah.
Because otherwise,
Constantly, and actually questioned and thought of it again, otherwise it becomes a planet, a comfortable place to talk about ethical, political, and then whatever you imagine.
public space, all these
Exactly. So why it is important for architecture, I think Stavros said it better than anybody. It is the occasion to produce other things, or the tension that exists or should be. So,
On that, my question was exactly on that. I was wondering if this how you understand the political part here, because what Stavros is talking about definitely hints to Hannah Arendt's space of appearance from human condition. This possibility of the people coming together. I do say so, I can argue in favor of that.
As Butler also says so.
Yes, as like the foundational political capacity of us coming together, even for a few seconds, not necessarily with our familiar. So this is the space of appearance. Like talks about that really beautifully. I think the way you describe it is what this hints to, and I was wondering if this is something that you. And I think Heidi is asking you to rewrite this in a very kind way.
Here, and to say something about that. It's not only to rewrite it, it's to be able, I think, no, what I mean is to be able to inhabit them. Right? Inhabit these statements that they have an effect. There is an effect involved, either comfort or discomfort, and the discomfort comes from the challenging of commonsensical understandings that we have about words that are, from my point of view, not just words, they are axiomatic. So when we say ethical, political, we shouldn't just comfortably think that we know what they mean, or assume that everybody understands where exactly we're positioned and what these things can do. When I say things, I mean properly as things.
Okay, this bites to the next.
Not the mic.
No, that's all right, no problem. No, but you can continue on that line because that's exactly, these are all connected with one another. So the next one is connected with what would we think as micro-political, without even using the term, opposing to a certain ideological domination of very abstract terms that don't really explain anything, okay? And that's what the whole semester, this semester, we dealt with radical empiricism, and I think most of the people that were part of the group many of the people that were part of the group are also here. And for radical empiricism, thought cannot be richer than reality. It's not richer. And anything of the non-conscious cognition is not an oxymoron because much more is felt than known. So we feel much more things than what we suppose we know. And what is interesting is an encounter between thought and that which makes thought act. So why do we do things? What is that moment that motivates someone to do stuff? Okay? Andrej mentioned before, this cannot happen by itself. So thought is not happening. Fortunately for us, it's not happening in the same way, metaphorically speaking, it's not happening the same way we're arranged here. It's not by sitting on a chair by yourself that thought is going to start getting into motivation to do stuff and think about stuff. It needs to encounter, it needs to provoke. Okay, someone needs to provoke you. You need to have an encounter with a provocation. That's what's the next point in there. In the shortest potential way, is that to think differently, and that's what Bason was saying, one has to feel differently. Does this respond on the political aspect, on the feeling versus thinking?
In fact, it does. So for me, it makes absolute sense. And it's based on, but I remember the time that I heard you say that some years ago. You feel and then you think. For me, I had a physical reaction to that. But so it's not only you saying this, but of course it makes sense. It makes sense. So in Spanish, you say sentir, pensar. You feel, then you think. Of course, you think about the things. You can have intentions about the thoughts about. That's exactly what I was trying to do there. With we think we know certain things, and what the value of certain words and the
the actual potential and the way that these words can affect material reality and the world and the Umbet and the collectivism. But it is not until the point where we are confronted to how we feel, you know, that these things actually are triggered. So yes, it is a form of politics.
But I would ask Robert if you see, I was taken by surprise. Again, bringing it to architecture, feeling, thought. How would you theorize on that connection? Is architecture able to produce new ways of feeling that eventually produce new ways of thinking? And if yes, how?
Give me a pointer what you were already thinking I should be answering.
No. I mean, I know what I will answer, but I'm just trying to see your perspective.
Can I give you some time? Like I can talk and then.
No, okay, I'm going to give an example.
You do it in your studio.
No. The very basic example. I mean, the weather. I like to say it's a very straightforward. The weather project by the Berlagezaal. Okay, I think that it did much more better in kind of informing in the philosophical sense of the term, informing people about climate change because they felt the change itself, rather than an infinite amount of data that supposedly informing about grades raising down there or up here. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. How could you think of architecture, both in how it's taught and how it's produced, as being able to do that? Because I think it is much more fundamental even than any art installation.
I mean, it has something to do with an effect about that what you feel are then relationships.
Yeah.
Changing relationships, differential relationships. These make you feel because that's what the body as a sensor basically registers and activates what's called the nervous system. No? So in a sense, in registering these things, what happens, of course, is that you're being affected by an environment. So what makes you feel is that you understand basically architecture and spaces as affective spaces. They have the capacity to affect you, and you as a space body has the capacity to both affect and be affected by your environment. And that's why, as you say, the unit has always to be the body plus milieu. So that's why, in a sense, even the distinction between a body and an environment is fake, because this is not a void, this is full of molecules, and I'm an intensive formation of differently composed molecules that interact with each other. And that material interaction articulates itself in dynamics that make me conscious. That's, in a sense, why radical empiricism brings it all onto the same plane. And only on that same material affective plane can these things be understood as a continuum.
Yeah.
Thank you. To add to that, Andrej Radman was both a philosopher and neuroscientist, which I find a very beautiful combination nowadays to be. In his recent book, The Action and Perception, and yeah, he has to.
It's actually different the mind or not something.
He has one also that says why we're more than normal.
Yeah.
He's talking about also not, of course, the feeling and the thinking, but also that what we feel and what we perceive is also related with what we know. You and me and somebody else will see, will be experiencing, will be part of the same thing, but our knowledge and our education and our cultural backgrounds will allow us, or will create also different feelings. So we have to also be a little bit open to know that it's not that one-to-one relationship. And he has examples with works of art or works of architecture, of course. And I know you were meaning feeling as the most kind of, yes, just like the kind of my nerves, the very raw, the very unmediated. But still, even for that knowledge and background, you can feel something way more intensely if what you see is part of your past experiences or past than what I would feel it even. Like, right, some people have the goosebumps on the mention of something.
Yeah.
So this is something we cannot.
But experience as lived experience, not experience as ideologized abstract transmission.
No, it's actually lived experience. No, it's actually lived experience. It's a really wonderful book and explained. It's very beautiful.
Yeah. then I announce already that I'm going to read the last. It's not the last, but I will make it the last, and then we can hear from the rest of the people here. Okay. Yeah.
I just want to say, Andrej is saying this action is for perception, and perception is for
Yes,
action.
exactly.
They cannot be separated. It doesn't make any sense because in order to perceive, you have to.
Exactly.
That was what I meant by intervening the cause of fabric. It's a perception that does not rely simply on sensation only, but it has information produced. The person that was, the great hero is the psychologist of perception, J.J. Gibson.
And I was wondering if
he found a way of bringing them together once and for all, and that's why he devised the idea of the concept of affordance. Because affordance is literally actual perception. And we did try a few years back in the 2013, we ran two graduation studios that approach architecture from the point of view of affordance. And so we had the same brief for everybody, and it was interesting to see how we could escape the attitudes, as Heidi called them, by simply approaching architecture from the point of view of affordance. How do you do affordance? I think it gives us a chance to pedagogical kind of device to challenge the attitudes.
And important.
Should be brief.
Yes, very brief, but it's also political. It also has like it's supposed to have this tension. So it's not only about it is about challenging. So it's not only challenging the platitudes, it's also destroying them, bringing something else. So that is
No, I didn't mean so brief.
But no, you cut my inspiration.
No, sorry. No, you keep the mic, because the next I'm gonna not even read it fully anyway. Because it is about
It should have been the last. So beautiful.
yeah, it's continuing. But forget about the morphogenesis part, okay? Let's focus on that. Yeah, because it's opening a discussion that's too broad for now. So let's say if engineering focuses on solution, architecture works with the problem so that we may come across an emancipatory potential. And problems always have a solution they deserve. So my question to the four of you briefly, and also to everyone, is what is architecture's problem?
I can answer to that. It's ambivalence. I think for me that is it's problem.
The problem with or of architecture?
No, the problem of architecture, that's why it's potentially so strong. It's always constantly linked, it's because it's ambivalent.
So what is architecture problematizing then? Okay.
Nobody is going to answer that.
No.
I would say organizations.
You really took me seriously for the briefness. I didn't mean it so. Okay.
I don't think architecture deals with problems. So I disagree with the statement.
Okay. You do what? You resent?
I disagree.
You disagree with the statement. Okay.
I disagree with the disagreement.
But you can discuss now. I was joking from the briefness, really. I mean, you could discuss it, and also, I mean, you could also intervene. Also, I mean, or anyone, yeah, if you would like to, on architecture's problem or problems.
Can I respond and then also ask a question?
Yeah. Not to me, to everyone. But
well, I think the problem, I don't know who said it, but I assume, I think Angeliki was who said it at the start, and maybe now you're saying there is not a problem, but I think the problem with architecture is precisely that it's between these two seats, between an exact science that it deals with kind of sort of humanities approach, and I think that's where architecture struggles because it fails to.
It's huge richness.
No, it is a richness, but it's also a problem. I mean, it's both. I think it's both at the same time. But maybe if I'm allowed to ask a question, because the thing I've been wondering, and Andrej, you can object to this, because I of course know that your book is a result of like years of writing on ecologies, but to me, it seems, as a sort of outsider, a lay person, that ecologies is having a sort of resurgence. I see ecologies and architecture everywhere at the moment. It's all about ecologies. And is this just me, or if this is so, why do you think there is a resurgence of this interest in sort of ecologies and architecture?
I think there's an opportunistic, pragmatic reason why people say ecology, because nobody can be against ecology and you name something ecology, it gets published because that wasn't my intention. I really wanted to take ecology out of the corner of greenwashing, and everybody was simply, I mean, there was a.
That's why it's black and not green.
There was a point here at Delft, every studio had green roofs and hunting trees all over. As if this was going to help in any way. I always wanted to claim ecology for something different, that is to say, the very irreducibility, non-entailment, to actually meet complexity at its own terms, without quickly reducing them to this or that downwards or upwards macro reductionism. So to me, it really is a code word. It's a shorthand for irreducible. And I think the problem of architecture, I'm trying to answer two questions simultaneously. Architecture happens to be really schizophrenic in the sense that we are technologically savvy enough to be able to read serious reports. I mean, we are engineers after all. But we are also well read, so we kind of could match the maybe sophistication of thinkers who come from the humanities. But at the same time, we are also immersed into art because we produce also, let's say, something that we consider to be artifacts and so on. So I think we happen to be one of the last disciplines that are not specialized in generalization, and because everybody else. And I've been working as an architect for a long time, and I always say I've met really sophisticated thinkers, most of them field spans. They would not talk to anybody because they were so good at what they do, completely disregarding how it might contradict or there has to be a resolution to the problem itself. So it seems to me that architecture is that discipline that can actually define the problem sufficiently so that it yields its own resolution, or literally resolution comes about as when you populate the field with everything you know, and don't rush quickly to offer a short circuit or the so-called solutions, and to go for the solution. And then I think in the last sentence it's important when we say that ultimately if you do that right in the right way, the solution as it presents itself, because you have taken into consideration all of these seemingly contradicting kind of vectors, or you said directionalism. There is something that Peter is mentioning, but it's not driven by anybody's fixation. It's not a free-floating imagination, you know, like as if we just break this line from our schools, think out of the box, the sky is the limit. What is that? There are limits, and these limits are really necessary for us to precisely because they help us, they are enabling constraints. They help us actually arrive at something that is much more sophisticated. They're just projecting something which always turns out to be completely distorted.
Then I want to give you about the problem. Okay.
The whole thing about problems. So again, problems where we have it's a beauty of a headache. So what I think is, and when I say the problem of architecture is that it's ambivalent. I mean, it's both. It's inclusive of everything. It's transversal. It's truly transdisciplinary. So when I think about how to explain what it is that I do to my 8 or 10-year-old child, this is exactly what I explain. So why I'm not an engineer only, is because engineers will actually solve the problem and deliver it. This is the so they start from that premise. And the day that architecture solves its problems, it's over. So that's I guess related to Tuni's quote as well. So it is in that production of constant problems that architecture exists and is the most productive. And it is truly transversal because you can't really address problems that are truly architectural to an architectural position exclusively. So you have to bring in engineering, you have to bring in the philosophy, you have to bring in the theory, you have to bring in the aesthetics, you have to let your imagination roll, you have to constantly be on the lookout, prancing over a problem. So that's where I think the ecologies actually design.
It's a cross-domain discipline, they call it. Literally, as I said,
Well, I find that one of the interesting things, of course, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about that architecture is basically formulated on wicked problems, now that they're basically underdetermined. And that means basically that there is no specific solution to be found. And I mean, also, Jorge always insists on the point that one is not to ask a more specific question. No? In the first place, that in a sense then teleonomically guides the design process towards a solution from a phase space of possibilities and like narrowing down the solution. And that's an environmental process, that's a collective process, reciprocal feedback process and so on. And I think that is very interesting because that means, and also the very wickedness of the problem emerges from the fact that architecture, also bringing back to Guattari, intersects a lot of very weird systems that do not match with each other. Fire regulations don't match with tastes, with ecological questions, with solar orientation, cultural systems, so on, you know, like those kind of things. And they cannot be brought together, and that's where this transversal aspect comes in the resolution and finding it and guiding this process in which the solution has to be shaped alongside with the specification of the question.
Does explain.
Yes.
No, what Heidi was talking about harmony, but I know something about linking between all these fields. To me, these are legitimate reasons. These are amazing. It's a luxury that makes all these things. And with Heidi turning to Angeliki, no, problems are our friends. I understand. I see that in a very different way. I understand because architecture has it's a magic thing to have to deal with all these difficulties. It's unbelievably fascinating, and that's why I think architecture has no problems. In that way, I say.
In that sense, you meant.
In that sense, that's what I meant. It's not, and it's not about answering, of course. And because of this unbelievable capacity to be juggling among all these worlds, right? To be able to deal with all these ambivalence, is because architecture is about like our aspirations, our dreams, the best of us. This is what architecture is about, and I consider that the best possible world to be in.
It affords all that.
Yeah, but that affords all that. No problems at all.
Anyone else?
Please.
If not, now, so it's exactly the time. So yeah. Jorge. Yeah.
Thank you. Congratulating you very much. And I'd like to propose a challenge for you. Probably in our for the next 10 or 12 years. You will need to complement this treatise with a man. The practical application of the treatise in practice.
Can we use your one of your studios for that?
To make ourselves available as a heuristic space for that endeavor.
Yeah, I second Jorge. You're more than welcome.
We did have.
It's on record.
Yeah, very happy.
But it also needs to be said that we did have a graduation studio, but it was discontinued because theory is not meant to do design.
Who says that?
It's on record. So this is
Okay, so forget the last. That's a problem.
No, but I totally agree with Jorge because also one weakness we're having, not just Andrej, I mean all of us, is what we can broadly call pedagogical, but it's a very broad sense. Pedagogical in the sense of what you mentioned as practical application. Again, calling it practical application is slightly diminishing, but in any case,
You can blame that.
No,
I still remain.
I'm trying to find. Yeah, I'm trying to find another word as well. I mean, how can you take that? I mean, like a
Expression.
yeah, like no, but how can you make the commentary, for example, that we need to be transdisciplinary? I mean, we're doing now we're working on a grant application, let's say, which is on transdisciplinarity essentially, okay? And it's also with other disciplines involved. And we speak about transdisciplinarity, but when you move from that I want to start transdisciplinary to the how do we do the start transdisciplinary, there you get into serious problems because that's why I'm proposing. I totally agree, but I find it the most important challenge, not just because we say things should be transdisciplinary, but in general, to face the so-called wicked. I don't think they're wicked because wicked is a negative term. To face interesting problems, I think you can only do it transdisciplinarily and by finding out what's the problem that we all share there. How? I don't know.
So second book faster.
10 only.
No, faster than 10 years.
Do you want to have a last word, Andrej, or any question?
I just want to thank everybody who made the time to be here. I mean, really, I really appreciate it. It's very, very, very kind. I'm so happy.
There is last one. We got it later. Okay, we will ask afterwards. We will ask afterwards. Okay. We will do a very nice closing.
Sit here. Yeah, okay, we can plus around it.
Okay, let's have. Let's stop sharing and then close the meeting. Okay? Yeah.
See you guys.
Ciao.